Welcome to the Ralston College podcast. I'm Stephen Blackwood. A few months ago, I had the pleasure of delivering a keynote lecture at the Symposium of Medieval and Renaissance Studies to commemorate the 1500th anniversary of the death of the great philosopher, poet, theologian, and statesman, Boethius. In that lecture, I spoke about the enduring power of his book, The Consolation of Philosophy, one of the best sellers of all Western civilization, beloved both by great figures like King Alfred and Elizabeth I, and a source of solace to countless readers whose names we'll never know. In this dramatic dialogue, a woman named Philosophy visits a prisoner who has lost everything, or you might say everything: his career, his wealth, his reputation, and soon he will lose his life. The question of this amazing, profoundly human little book is whether there's any stable meaning or order in the midst of injustice, suffering, distraction, and the unstoppable passage of time. Through their exchange in both poetry and prose, over 5 short books, Philosophy returns the prisoner to inner stability and true self-knowledge by uncovering in the inescapable finitude and temporality that define human life an infinite and eternal ground. Though we live in a time of remarkable material comfort, there is an undeniable counter-narrative that vast numbers of individuals feel their particular lives lack a kind of weight, or you might say, don't seem to matter at all, a phenomenon described as the meaning crisis. The consolation holds tremendous relevance today because of the compassionate, deep, beautiful, and at once unflinchingly tough love and rational approach it offers to the question of our time, indeed, of all humans and at all times. How do we find and understand ourselves in relation to what really matters? I don't know of a work of literature or philosophy that has more important or more beautifully and powerfully conveyed truths than this remarkable and beloved book. I hope you enjoy this lecture. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Thanks for listening.
Really, it's profoundly humbling for me to be here today with all of you on this, celebrating this, or noting this 1500th anniversary, this millennium and a half since this extraordinary figure died, put to death, for some a martyr, and such an inspiration for so many people over that millennium and a half. So, my topic, as Anthony said, is the enduring consolation of Boethius. And I hope you'll forgive me if today I speak somewhat personally, in a sense, loosely, from a kind of 30,000-foot level in a way, as I tried to step back from the text and ask, why is this text so powerful still? And so if my talk lacks a kind of scholarly precision and so on, I hope you'll forgive me for that. Let me start here. In 1918, from what we can tell, this little volume, this very volume, was acquired by the British War Office. This is the lobe that came out that year, and it had been decided that the lobe should be collected by the British War Office. And so whatever that book meant then and there, it was thought that it was an important acquisition at that point in time with all that was afoot in the world in 1918. After 1,500 years, of course, the perennial power of the consolation of philosophy needs no proofing. We all know that simply to be a fact, for the way it speaks to transcendent and timeless human themes, especially perhaps about the role that suffering plays in human life and how and whether it can be made sense of. After 1,500 years, of course, that's well established, with figures like Alfred and Chaucer, Dante, Aquinas, Moore, Elizabeth I, to name but a few. Or more recently, C.S. Lewis or Pope Benedict XVI. These are all figures for whom Boethius has been important. But I start with this idea that this volume was collected by the War Office just over 100 years ago in Britain, so that it puts in sharp relief the question that, in a way, is the question I've taken for this paper, which is not whether this book endures, but why, and perhaps why and how it might speak to us today, especially. I've grouped my talk into three sections. The first is to focus on the individual, the nature of human subjectivity. The second, talk about truth. And third, how these two are related. And of course, all of these things in and through the consolation itself. So I think that it's important to begin with the individual because the consolation is written by and to, as it were, you might say, a man in the midst of a very tumultuous time and very tumultuous circumstances. And certainly in our time, there's a great deal of tumult, whether that's political or geopolitical or technological or civic or psychological. It's a great sort of crisis of meaning, leading to individuals who are alienated or fragmented, whether from one another or from history. Loneliness, anxiety, and depression famously on the rise. I think in the midst of all that, the consolation speaks to the individual as the site of where meaning, you might say, goes down. Not outside or somewhere else, but in the soul, let's say. One of my deepest contentions, and again, I hope you'll forgive me for speaking in such a non-scholarly mode and personally, but is that every human being is a kind of Stradivarius, made to play notes and music that only he or she can play. Made, you might say, for the mountaintop. And yet, so many people do not know that they are made to play that music. And if you don't know, you can't. I've been reading Viktor Frankl's The Man's Search for Meaning. Is that how it's translated in English? I think I'm reading it in English to be clear. But and Frankl is very clear about this, that the inner world, you need to have the inner world in order to have the inner world, if I could put it that way. Like you need to have a kind of depth unfolded in yourself in order to be able to turn to those depths at the moments that you need them. So I think that, in our time, you might say that the inner world of the self needs to be excavated, for the individual. No one can do it for you. You have to do it for yourself. By nature, it's only you, in a way, who can unfold those depths of the self, discover them, illuminate them. And I think without that unfolding, one is subject to, the external, to the vicissitudes of fortuna, let's say. And there's a whole hell of a lot working against that unfolding today. Including these devices, which are algorithmically optimized to exploit our dopaminergic cycles in ways that no human being has ever in history been prepared for. And for me, this is a huge problem. And I spent a lot of my life thinking about Boethius. And so, I just want to put before us what I take to be really quite a profound crisis, which is to say that we have, some of the most powerful forces on the planet today conspiring to exploit the spiritual energies of human beings and to keep them, in that sense, alienated from themselves, to prevent them from excavating those depths of their selves. And of course, there are many other things, geopolitical and cultural, technological. I don't mean to be reductive. I'm trying to point towards a few things in the complex, in the infinitely complex reality of our own time and culture. I want to tell you a story, though, that I think brings out kind of two sides of this alienation. I was on an airplane a few years ago, and I had a conversation, as one does, with the person next to me. But it's not very often that one has a conversation that one remembers, perennially coming back to. It was so powerful to me. This woman and with her husband, had adopted two children from the same very dysfunctional home. And that home It's a very, very sad story. The mother in that home was simply incapable of making any connection with her children, and so they were profoundly neglected. She was herself obviously so tragically damaged that she apparently said, well, no, he doesn't want to be picked up. Just look at him. You can tell he doesn't want it. This was the story this woman told me next in the plane. So there's a boy and a girl that they both ended up adopting into their own family. And she said to me that they exhibited their severe sort of detachment syndrome in opposite ways. In the girl's case, she wanted to be constantly, even inappropriately, always physically connected with her parents. And in the boy's case, which is very, sad, but you can sort of understand it. In the boy's case, it took the opposite form, even sadder, which was to deny that he wanted any affection or connection. And I'm grateful or pleased, you might say, happy to be able to say that as they stayed in that home, they in the love of that family, they stabilized. And I don't mean to make it seem as if it was easy, and no doubt those children have all kinds of difficulties ahead of them, as every human being does. But I want to frame our own time in a way that I think we see both of these, you might say, ways of dealing with the crisis of meaning in our moment. You might say, on the one hand, you have a kind of demand that there be an immediate existential, no, I want to be this and I must be this now, quite apart from any of the constraints or realities out there. And on the other hand, you have a kind of shrug, a kind of cynicism. None of it matters. There's no kind of nihilistic, there's no love. It's all a construct anyway. Why would I ever put myself out, make myself vulnerable for some kind of, meaning or truth or beauty? So I think we have both of these two sides in a sense in our time now. And, Boethius, I think, is very clear, and this is one of the key things I want to bring out. There is no remedy for the self that is not at both once within the self, in the self, and transcending the self. The thing is, until you can get to that remedy, you have to kind of withdraw. You have to come back to the bedrock of your own subjectivity. And I think that Boethius is a great teacher of that unfolding, let's say. He's a great teacher of that withdrawing, and specifically in the first couple of books of the Consolation. He's a great teacher of the ways to retrieve and recover and recollect the self from dissipation, forgetfulness, from being lost and adrift. Pulling back, the great kind of Neoplatonic withdrawal from the world, and those early books with their just absolutely sharp arguments, And is this jewel yours? No. And it goes through, goes through, riches and wealth and power and all of the honor and offices. And so that withdrawing, I think this is such a, in the midst of these devices that do everything they can to pull us out. I think that this withdrawing is that Boethius in the Consolation so brilliantly, tenderly and beautifully brings out is such a needful moment in the midst of Instagram and all of the incentives for what Boethius at least would see as limited and finite and ultimately external goods, whether it's wealth or fame or notoriety or whatever. The shiny but limited goods, external goods of materialism, fame, wealth, and power, that's, I think, is really fundamental to what the entire Consolation is about and speaks loudly to us now. Now, don't take me wrong. I don't think the only ways to that recovery of the self, the inner life, have to do with, philosophy or literature or learning languages or history or going to museums, as infinitely rich as all of those ways are. When I was writing this book, before it was became a book, when it was still but a doctoral dissertation, I was working on I discovered that there's some quite complicated poetic patterns in this text, really quite complicated. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I didn't invent them, of course, or I don't think I did. I just kind of stumbled across them like you do, how scholarship is. You sort of, you stumble across something in a field, like, you just tripped over it. You didn't invent it. It was just there and you happened to trip over it. But they were really complicated and they were really there. And I, as some of you may know, I developed a kind of thesis that these patterns in the poetry were a kind of acoustic fabric that was woven as a way of mediating time and eternity, that it was to stabilize the prisoner's kind of experience in this acoustic oral way. But the reason I bring this up is because, I was living with my wife in the woods of Vermont at the time, and it was a great year. But I was sort of musing. She was away for a few days, and my brother had come to visit in the midst of my really thinking, I think these things are really here, but I'm sure they're here, but can they really mean anything? Like, this is ridiculous in a sense. Look how complicated. This is the hardcover, the soft cover's coming out here is out, but it is a tenth the price of this one. So don't, please, if you're inclined to want to get this book. It also has the color diagrams in it, which are much easier to follow. But the reason I put them in color, it was so important to me, is because I wanted them to be more legible. And I was wondering, was it even possible that these could be like remotely important? Or was this just a kind of scholarly secret underneath the hood that had nothing really to do with things? Because it was just too complex. So I was visiting. My brother had come to visit me in Vermont, and I'd taken him back to the bus stop in Burlington. And I was driving back to where we were living. I came across a woman at the side of the road hitchhiking, and don't very often see these days hitchhikers, let alone typically pick them up. But she seemed desperate, and so I stopped. And before I even had the car had even come to a complete stop, she opened the back door and thrown her bag of things in, and there we were driving along, and she was quite upset. She's a woman who lived some pretty hard life, and she shared with me something of her family story, and it was pretty rough, and it was very sad. And she had just something fairly traumatic happen just recently. Her daughter was in prison, and so on. But she began to calm down as we were talking, and she asked, did I have anything to smoke, a cigarette? And I happened to have a little hand rolling drum tobacco in the car. So I rolled her a cigarette, and we chatted. And I got to asking her, what is it, what do you do? Her name was Constance. What do you do to, what do you do for fun? Or what do you do to relax? Or however I put it. And she said, oh, I love to knit. And I said, oh, do you? Really? Okay, that's good. And she said, I said, are you knitting anything right now? She said, well, yes, I am. I'm knitting a big blanket. And I said, really? I was telling about it. She said, well, she says there's 12 sections, and each of the sections has 4 sections, and each of those sections has so many sections, and then the colors, and they repeat, and they, goodness sakes, this is more complicated than Boethius. And so, the reason I share this is because, of course, literature and philosophy, these are the great records of humanists about what a human life is about, how this is the beacons from the past, helping us understand our own time and place. But, there are many ways into the depths of the self. There are many ways into this. One of them I discovered from Constance. Frankl, reflecting on how life in the camps was inherently degrading, says nonetheless, and I quote, he says, the consciousness of one's inner value is anchored in higher, more spiritual things and cannot be shaken by camp life. But how many free men, he continues, let alone prisoners, possess it? Well, I want to suggest that one of the things the consolation does is recollect the individual to the fact of an inner life. And it is indeed Boethius who, as a prisoner, even in his own forgetful and alienated state, articulates a longing for that freedom in and a reconciliation with the world as it is. You might say that the consolation expresses a hunger for justice amidst injustice, a hunger for home amidst exile, a hunger for meaning. Frankl famously said, people said, were you surprised that this book was such a bestseller? And he says something like, he was saddened by it, if anything. He said, how can a book called, Man's Search for Meaning sell millions of copies if that question were not, he says, underneath the fingernails of the time? Like, it's a bad thing that the book is selling so well in that sense. It's a good thing, of course, because if there's a need, then you get what I'm saying. But There's that lovely line in the Consolation, put this in a slightly more humorous, let's say, manner, when he said, he says, your soul knows the way home, but like a drunk man, he does not know the way. Perhaps a few of us have been there. And I think that, what needs to be said here at this moment is that, the Consolation's answer to these questions is not a Gnostic one. It's not as an escape from the world. The Consolation is shot through with an insistence that this world, this finite world here and now, matters. It's the most human, I think, of all demands, not for an escape, but for a sense that this life counts. Here and now, mine. Not in the abstract, but this one here and now. And that it be understood to matter. My sense of young people today is that they want to be taken seriously. But, that takes themselves taking themselves seriously. It takes that discovery of the inner life. And so the question is, how do we help each other take each other seriously? How do we tell each other take themselves seriously? I think it's a very helpful shorthand to talk about our time as in the midst of a kind of a meaning crisis. And, try as we might, at an existential level to insist that, I don't know, these are all constructs, or, I'm an individual that can just, world into myself. And I know there's a truth in all that. That in a way is my point. But there's also the fact that that on its own is patently inadequate. If meaning were something we could simply generate out of ourselves, just go home for the weekend and make a whole bunch of it. And, like printing money or something, which also it turns out apparently doesn't work very well. But, if you just go home for the weekend and just make a whole bunch of meaning, you just have a big bank of it, and you just go there anytime you needed a bit of the, shot from the meaning bank, and that would be that. I know it's it's an absurd example to give, but the point I'm making is that really, meaning fundamentally is, within the self, as the self locates itself in something it perceives to be beyond the self. And that, I think, is the fundamental dynamic of meaning, which means you need both the excavation of the self and a sense of the transcendent realities that can ground and liberate that very self. So that's the first kind of trajectory I wanted to go on, was in relation to the individual. The second is in relation to truth. The Consolation at the most fundamental level is making an argument about there being a rational order, that there is, in fact, objectively, as a fact, a nature to things. It is objective. It is not subject to the will or whims of the self. There's not to say, I think importantly, that it is simply speaking independent of the self. I think that's going too far. But it does exist outside of our whims and wishes. It is really there. I think this is a very powerful counter to the relativism and the nihilism of our moment, and to you might say, to a post-truth pretense, which is kind of contradictory assertion of the moment. The work is unflinching, has a kind of unflinching rationality. Now, I will be the last person to reduce the Consolation to an argument in some cool, calm, and collected way. But it is sure as heck is there. It is a powerful, we're talking about, one of the greatest thinkers at the height of his powers, making an argument. And this is not about, this is not about belief, I would say. Yeah, there are maybe aspects of this when one can get into the Consolation, but fundamentally, I don't think the Consolation is a work of belief, in the sense in which, is 2 + 2 = 4? Do you believe that, or do you know that? It's a kind of question about what is the register of knowing, the character of the knowing that you're talking about. And I think the Consolation's argument is an argument at the level of intellect, understanding. It is not a matter of conjecture or, if we concede these things, then those. It's operating at the level of the axiomatic and the understanding, I would say. Now, I know that we could have a very lively conversation about this with the scholars in the room. But my basic contention is that what is going on here is not simply belief or conjecture, but an argument that Boethius thinks is true. Thinks is true. Thinks he knows it is true. Let me put it that way. Thinks he knows it is true. And that does not mean it does not make it easy. It does not mean that it's a simplification or a reduction of the world. The whole work is shot through with the pain of life, for God's sakes. It does not suggest that it is easy or that there is no suffering. The whole question is of suffering. But it does assert that the order is good. I think there's something in this, and Boethius' approach here, that is just so humblingly and inspiringly perennialist. This is just the sheer humility of it in a way, to say, as Plato taught, and as this person, and as that person, and sometimes the people are pointed out, and sometimes they aren't. But, there's a sense in which I think, what Boethius is turning to in the midst of his own extraordinary suffering is the wisdom of others, the wisdom of the past. And of course, this is one of the amazing dynamics that come out here, is that, in fact, there is this very brilliant dialectic between tradition and creativity, or between craft and innovation, let's say. So I think that it's a very interesting thing that this book, that I argue is in many respects astonishingly creative and innovative in its literary style and so on and so forth, that it is speaking with a kind of perennial voice that I think in a time of our own, there's a kind of cult of progress and the presentism of our moment, where it's been better than ever and faster and whatever else than ever. And again, don't take me to be making it sort of a cheaper, wrong-headed, sort of speaking out of ingratitude in relation to our current moment. Rather, what I'm wanting to express is that I think our moment is characterized by an absolutely brutal and potentially fatal presentism. And I think the consolation, there's a sense in which Boethius is, I think, showing us how to have a relation to the past that is about the present. Crucially, I can't resist saying that, in an era, our own, in which whenever, the adjective medieval, any time I see the adjective medieval on Twitter, for example, I know it's coming as ignorant, because it's almost always being used as a pejorative. And, no one who knows anything about the Middle Ages, I don't think, can use medieval, simply speaking, as a pejorative, not the age of Aquinas and the Gothic cathedrals and Abelard and so on and so forth. In any event, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I see that as one small, and I'm being a little facetious here, but one small index of a presentism that I think is profound. Part of the talk, I'm wanting to point towards the consolation as it is articulating an order, the order of reality, the goodness, the knowableness of that order. And I want to return to this in the third section of the talk, but I just want to suggest that, the key about this, really, whether we are understanding this in relation to the Timaeus, which of course is beautifully sort of summarized at 3M9, whether we understand this in terms of the Logos, as articulated so famously and beautifully in the first words of the Gospel of John, itself within a long tradition thinking of the Logos, or the Imago Dei of Augustine. Ultimately, what is going on here is a relating of the individual with the cosmos. It's not simply the world in its externality. And I profoundly believe that the Platonic tradition, that you might say, broadly speaking, Boethius is within, in his bringing of these two things together, it offers an antidote to both post-Enlightenment reductionism, scientism, on the one hand, and to a kind of anti-rational romanticism or existentialism on the other. And I think we have both of these in our own time as kind of post-Enlightenment polarities. And I think the Platonic tradition that Boethius inhabits transcends these unmoored extremes by offering a complex account of the self, its powers and faculties, in relation to reality broadly construed. So it refuses reductionism on the one hand, and on the other hand shows these powers of the self to be coherent and each to have its own mode of knowing the same ultimate good. We'll return to this connection, but at this point, I simply want to state that as part of the reality, the order that Boethius thinks he's articulating, there is, he thinks, objectively an order to the self. Sense, imagination, reason, and intellect, as he puts it, right? There is a structure to the self that exists independent, you might say, of whether we believe in it or assent to it or like it or lump it. It's there. And that's a critical part of the argument because it's what mediates the relation between the self and the world in the way that I hope to get to in a moment. But still, if I can just stay for another moment with this theme of the, you might say, truth, I think really powerful in Boethius is the sense in which the truth as he presents it transcends the narrowness of a kind of doctrine. There's a universality as he presents things. I think this is a very powerfully intentional for Boethius. I mean, how can we know what he intended? So we can only say that it's there. Of course, I'm not the first person to find it very interesting that the Consolation is a work written by the same author of his theological tractates, and yet, good luck finding, mentions of the Trinity or Christ or whatever in this text. And I think this is a very powerful. Clearly, there's nothing counter or contradictory in my reading with Christianity broadly conceived. But I think it's interesting that this troubles people so much today. And not only today, I know, but it seems to me that it's especially peculiar to an age that insists on tribalism while denying universality, that we cannot appreciate what Boethius is up to, which is to transcend tribalism by universality in an affirmation of the individual's participation in that universal order. I cannot resist reading here one of my favorite things ever written about the Consolation by the late Robert Krauss, who was one of my teachers. He died in 2010, I think it was. And Krauss said, he wrote in the lovely, 3-page paper, in his final work, that in his being reference to Boethius, he is most directly concerned with the problems, not pagan or Christian, but universal, of understanding the rational order of the world, the vagaries of fortune, and the nature of man's freedom. Lady philosophy is not natural or revealed, not philosophy or theology. She is simply sapientia, who can lift her head to pierce the very heavens. She is not Platonist or Aristotelian, a Stoic or a Neoplatonist. Conflicting scholars have violently torn away fragments from her vesture, yet she stands with unabated vigor. She is simply wisdom, old and young, all philosophy, which in its highest speculative form is called theology. It seems to me this is how we might think about going about rebuilding a common culture, by recovering a knowing grasp of what we are in relation to what is highest and best. And this brings me to the third and final part of my paper, which I'm going to endeavor to relate the individual, as I've sort of sketched it out in a sense, as a theme, and truth, you might say, as a theme. The relating of these two is the third part of my paper, and I've entitled that Pedagogy. This, for me, is what is most ultimately, what is greatest, what is the most characteristic aspect of this work of genius, what is most powerful and lasting in this book is its pedagogical character. You could call that a rhetorical character, but it's the fact of how it speaks as designed in order to do so. One can say that this is a needful aspect of any communication. You always have to think about the person you're speaking to if you want to convey a certain content, whether it's a set of directions or advice for life or how to make your mother's shepherd pie. Right? You always have to think about the status of the person you are trying to convey that to and how you can convey that to them in a way that they will understand. Otherwise, what the hell are you doing? I mean, you're not communicating at all. It has to be that the listener, the hearer, you've thought about how he or she can take on what you think you have to share with them. And gosh, I mean, I just think Consolation does this in a way, and I'm not really that well read, to be honest with you. So if I were to tell you this is the only book I have ever read, it would not be quite true, but would be kind of true. And so, but I'm going to say of the books that I know of no text that does this as beautifully and brilliantly. Boethius does not ask us to choose between poetry and philosophy, or between the image and the idea. The Consolation's form and structure embody its governing principles, from the first word through to the end, to virtually any detail in between. I think it is important to dwell just for a moment on the fact that beauty plays such a role in this work. I mean, and poetry, and I know we can't get, some of us have spent a lot of time with those questions, so I won't do more than just gesture to them, and I just think I've just got to read a few lines. So here at the very beginning, the prisoner, as you know, is kind of lost in his tumult of emotions, as philosophy calls him, and says, "Gosh, you're not ready for any serious or tough medicine yet. You're not ready really for thinking. Let's be honest. I mean, look at you, for God's sakes. What a mess. But you're ready for something. What are you ready for? You're ready for the gentler medicines," she says. And just the way this glyconic meter, and again, I'm the last person who should be writing a book about Latin poetry, and I really mean that. But the way, as I hear it, that this meter, which is all about the stability of the seasons, the stable order of, summer leading to fall, to winter, and what each of these seasons brings, cum foibi radiis graue, concris sidus senaistuat, tumqui larga negantibus, sulcis semina credidit. And it just goes on and on. It's so beautiful. Boethius would say, I think the argument is not enough. Or what the hell is an argument? I mean, if you're looking to move someone from here to here, well, it's more about movement, right? It's, I think this is such an important question because, I said earlier that the self has a structure that is coherent and can mediate the world, and we know in Boethius that he talks about, sense, imagination, reason, and intellect being the four parts or capacities or faculties of the soul. What we see in this text is that the text is structured around those capacities to restore and heal them one by one, so you have to bring about a kind of coherent personality. And I just think this is massively relevant to our own time. This vision of the whole soul, of the whole person. The wisest man I ever knew gave me some advice. It's a long time ago now, nearly 30 years ago. He said, whatever you do, he said, you got to let the whole soul come along. And when he said that to me, I'm not sure I had much of an idea of what he was talking about, but it stayed with me. And I don't pretend that I've got a full grasp of that, but I think that's what's going on in this book. I'm sure that's what's going on here, is this attempt to bring the whole soul along. And I think that there's an immensely powerful wisdom here, interpersonally, frankly, just for the status of all of our own relationships all the time. If you're not thinking in that dynamic of the human being as a whole thing with different capacities and so on, you're just not thinking about human beings at all. And so, and good luck winning an argument if you don't go about it that way, right? I mean, because even if you win the argument through some, rhetorical pyrotechnics or, you've not brought anyone along by that, right? I mean, it's a question of how we bring people along. I think it is so wonderfully showed here. And so, I think the book has an immense wisdom about what a human being is, what the soul is. As many of you know, Aristotle, I just love this quote when he says, "Holding as we do that, while knowledge of any kind is a thing to be honored and prized, one kind of it may, either by reason of its greater exactness or of a higher dignity and greater wonderfulness in its objects, be more honorable and precious than any other. On both accounts, we should naturally be led to place in the front rank the study of the soul." Isn't that true? So, one thing that I think is very characteristic of the Consolation, and especially of its beginning point, is that it has simultaneously it's both profoundly compassionate and it just has serious tough love, right? And these things, I think, are both necessary to each other. And the sensitivity and compassion of the beginning point, he cannot even recognize, the teacher of his youth, philosophy. She sees and she comes from without. This is not just a literary device. There's something very powerful being indicated here about how human beings can get into places where they can't find their way out, that they're lost to their own, psychological distress, woe is me, loop. And, along comes philosophy, external and very harsh, of course, about the muses of poetry. There's so much to think about there that we can't pause on now. But, the first moment you might say is one of other than her setting the scene about how this recovery can take place, which he has, no power over. Her first moment in relation to him is this moment of just beautiful, compassionate tenderness, where she makes a fold in her dress and wipes the tears from his eyes so that he can begin to see the journey that he is on and recognize her as the teacher of his youth. So there's I just think, incredibly moving moment right at the beginning. And then, whammo, the tough love comes in. Holy smokes. She says, gosh, listen to you talk. I can't stand this. Here you blah, 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 blah. You go on talking about you're in exile. Well, I'll tell you, you've exiled yourself, if you want to call it that way. I mean, it is so harsh. Imagine talking to your kids that way, or anyone. I mean, well, maybe we should. But the balance is, this is what I'm trying to get at here. The balance is that this compassion and the tough love are both necessary to each other. It's the compassion that makes the tough love possible, and it's actually the tough love is another form of compassion. Precisely because these reconnect him to what is. They offer him hope in an order that is both within and outside of himself. I think this is a fundamental aspect of all of this. This tough love is so important because, she is just unflinching on this, right? This is an anti-fatalist message, fundamentally, right? This is an anti-victimhood. This is not anti-victims. This is an anti-victimhood, because she's saying, no, if anyone can take it away from you in any circumstances ever whatsoever, it was not yours, and woe unto you for putting your faith in that thing. And so she is absolutely, brutally just saying, no. If it depends on what anyone else can do other than yourself, then you are looking in the wrong place. You have opened your sails up to the wind, as she says, and you're going to now have to let yourself blow where she pleases. And so I think there's a profound affirmation of human agency in this. But the question is, how is that agency unlocked when it is in a loop of kind of woe is me despair? I think it is fundamental to this pedagogy that it is for all of that utterly and totally non-coercive. There is nothing in this book that the prisoner does not come to see himself through his own, you might say, free agency. I know it's mediated by her pedagogy. That's what the whole book is about. But there is no moment of coercion or violence. This works according to the capacities that the prisoner has. So it's a profound affirmation of the free subjectivity of the human being. I thought, through violence and power, or whatever you want to call it, you can get people to say they believe things some of the time. They did that pretty well, I think, in North Korea. So it's not true that you can't force someone to say things or even to think that they think something. And if you really I'm taking an extreme example just to make the point. But, I've come to think that there's nothing you can do to force someone to see something, to understand something, right? Like that moment you go, oh, I get it now. I think that is irreducibly free. I don't think there's anything you can do to bring that about in someone. It's a free assent of the subject. And I think that this is the way that consolation works as a brilliant work of pedagogy. And dialogue is clearly at the heart of it. That, it's not philosophy just saying, okay, I'm going to tell you how things are, and then somehow he's meant to get it. No, in fact, the whole work is this step-by-step series of micro tweaks, and each step being opened up by the last step, and then the next step, oh, wait, no, I can see you're not quite ready for that one. Let's now go to this one. And then, so this whole thing is a kind of an irreducibly personal and individual dialogue that, again, I think in that aspect of it is profoundly illuminating of, well, what it means to have a conversation and what it means to have the good of others in mind. What it means to be a conversationalist on both sides, you might say, whether it's you helping someone see something or whether, in fact, you are the person that needs help in seeing something. And as we all know, we're always in any conversation, both of those people. In its affirmation of freedom, in its affirmation of the particularity of the individual, I think that the consolation is really pointing towards consciousness as not simply speaking on its own, but as an antidote to suffering. Consciousness of oneself in relation to what is highest and best. So I think we have here a deliberately personal pedagogy, one that is disciplined and determined, that affirms both the freedom and the capacity of the listener. I think it is worth noting, in conclusion here, before I come to the end, that the consolation, and Pope Benedict makes this point. I only encountered his 2008 thing last weekend, actually. But he makes, I think, very importantly, the point that Boethius is writing at a time of cultural encounter, right? And so at a moment in which, his own sense of what things are is needing to be made understandable, comprehensible in a very new cultural political moment. But it's also in a moment in which violence is destroying culture. And I think that all of these things are pertinent to our moment, in which, we're both at a moment of, astonishing, cultural exchange and newness and instability and movement, but also at a moment in which culture itself is being destroyed, forgotten from any number of angles. So I often say about Boethius that one thing, I don't want to say he's taught me because it's a very hard lesson to really learn, but is that the future is not up to us. I think Boethius, at least as I like to think of him, I think that he thought that his life's work was somehow re-articulating or re-illuminating, recollecting, fundamental, truths and realities, whether they're about the soul or disciplines and domains of knowledge. Surely he must have hoped, at least, that in some sense he was bringing back into play things that could enable a flourishing or a return to flourishing or a greater flourishing in his own time. And that was not to be. And we too, live in tumultuous times and face a very uncertain future. I don't know if you've followed at all what the people most involved in AI say about AI. But it's very disconcerting at a minimum. But it also raises, in a way, a very direct question, which is that whatever, let's call the computers and what they can do entirely good all the time, just for the sake of the argument. And all of the things that they can do for us, not malign. But, the truth of the matter is, at the end of the day, you can't depute living your own life to a machine, not if you want to live your life. So you might say the greater the technological thing, the more the powers become, the more urgent, the more pressing become the reclaiming or the risk that we lose the realm of our own consciousness and the realm of our own inner life. It's like, I think it needs to be said that since I got the phone that had the map in it, I am much less able of navigating the world, even the world not far from where I live, than I would have been had I not had it. And so what I'm saying, there is a kind of zero-sum game here. And I think that we are living on the precipice of a moment in which we're going to need to, at a minimum, ask anew what the status is of human subjectivity, if we want there to be any for us to have. I think that from Boethius we have a beautiful example, not one of having insight into the future or have how our labors, intellectual or otherwise, will stack up and what good they will or ill they will do in the world. I think from Boethius, in a way, there's such a beautiful and humbling lesson, which is that we can only be faithful to do what we can with the time we have. And the big picture is not actually in our hands. These are the three themes, broadly speaking, that I want to bring to you today as aspects or reasons why the consolation still speaks with such enduring consolatory power. The individual as the site of meaning for the individual as a capacious and rich and unfolded reality, an affirmation of that individuality, of truth, of being, let's say, long on truth, on the eternal realities as the source, the only source of regeneration, and as actually sovereign. And third, of a vision of how these are connected, a vision of pedagogy, of conversation, of ways of opening up the self to understand itself in relation to ultimate reality, and to know itself as made to know those things. Indeed, as a manifestation of them, and as a thing of great beauty and truth in itself. Whatever the precise motives of the British War Office in collecting this volume, I think we, too, now face threats both from without and within, and must answer the existential question of how to recollect, to rediscover, to dignify, and to celebrate what is most vital in the human spirit, and to transmit the conditions for its realization in our own time and culture and beyond.
You've been listening to the Ralston College podcast. Today's episode was a lecture on the enduring power of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, written 1,500 years ago this year. It is a book that asks and offers powerful answers to some of the hardest questions human beings ask. I encourage you all to pick it up, whether to read it for the first time or to return to it again. Should you wish to engage works like the Consolation of Philosophy, you may consider applying to be part of Ralston College's MA in the Humanities program, an intensive one-year course. Frankly, it's the adventure of a lifetime. Designed to cultivate excellence by providing a space for true intellectual freedom marked by beauty, fellowship, and the pursuit of truth. We have a generous scholarship program that ensures that financial means will not be a barrier to any admitted student. To learn more about Ralston College's MA in the Humanities, or to support the college's mission in other ways, you can visit our website at www.ralston.ac. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Till next time.